What if the oldest written records weren't documenting human history, but preserving memories of something that came before? What if the Sumerians, who gave us the world's first cities and the first written words, were not describing their own origins, but carefully recording the rise and fall of those who walked the earth when humanity was still learning to speak? Beneath the desert sands of southern Iraq, where the Tigris and Euphrates once wove through a landscape so fertile, the Greeks would later call it the cradle of civilization, clay tablets rest in darkness. Pressed into their surfaces 5,000 years ago are lists that make no sense. Kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years, cities that existed before the flood, sages who were not quite human, teaching the first people how to build, how to plant, how to watch the movements of stars. The scribes who recorded these things did not write them as myths or legends. They wrote them as history, as carefully documented fact, preserved with the same precision they used to record grain harvests and temple inventories. So before the story pulls you under, take a moment to like this video and hit subscribe, but only if you're drawn to mysteries that make us question everything we think we know about the beginning of human civilization. And if you're still here, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I want to imagine this ancient question stretching across the world, connecting all of us who wonder what really came before. In 1896, German archaeologist Hermann Hilprecht was cataloguing tablets in the Imperial Museum in Istanbul when he found something that would trouble historians for the next century. It was a fragment of what would become known as the Sumerian King List, and it began not with the names of familiar rulers or the founding of cities anyone recognized, but with a simple, impossible statement written in wedge-shaped cuneiform. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. What followed was a chronology that defied everything scholars thought they understood about the ancient world. Hilprecht was no stranger to Sumerian tablets. He had spent years deciphering the wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay, learning to read a language that had been dead for nearly 4,000 years. But this tablet was different. As he worked through the dense, cuneiform script, carefully translating each line, he found himself checking his work again and again, certain he must have misunderstood the numerical notation. The Sumerian base 60 counting system could be complex, easy to misinterpret if you weren't careful. But no matter how many times he rechecked, the numbers remained the same. Impossible numbers. Numbers that described kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years. The fragment in Istanbul was just the beginning. Over the following decades, archaeologists excavating sites across Mesopotamia began finding more copies of the same text. Some were nearly complete, others were fragmentary, but they all told the same story with remarkable consistency. The King List existed in multiple versions, copied and recopied by Sumerian scribes across centuries, preserved alongside temple records and administrative documents. These weren't hidden texts, mythological stories kept separate from real history. They were filed together with grain inventories and tax records, treated by the ancient scribes as equally factual, equally worthy of careful preservation. What made this even more perplexing was the character of the document itself. The Sumerian King List was not written like mythology. It lacked the poetic language of epic tales, the dramatic narratives of divine intervention that characterized Mesopotamian religious texts. Instead, it read like a bureaucratic record, dry and precise. Each entry followed the same format: the name of a king, the city where he ruled, and the length of his reign. Then the next king, the next city, the next impossibly long reign. The scribes who created this list approached it with the same methodical care they brought to recording the annual flooding of the Euphrates or the quantity of barley stored in temple granaries. As more copies emerged from excavations at Nippur, Lhasa and Ur, scholars could reconstruct the full text with increasing confidence, and what they found challenged the very foundation of how civilizations were supposed to develop. According to every theory of cultural evolution, societies progressed slowly from simple to complex. Hunter-gatherers became farmers. Farmers built villages. Villages grew into towns. Towns eventually, over many centuries, developed into cities with writing and organized government. This was the accepted narrative, the logical progression that made sense of human development across the globe. But the Sumerian King List suggested something different. It described kingship as something that descended from heaven, a gift or inheritance rather than a gradual human invention. Before the historical kings whose reigns could be verified through archaeology and cross-referenced with other sources, before the dynasties whose existence no one doubted, the list recorded something else. An age when kings ruled from cities that the Sumerians themselves considered ancient. An epoch that ended not through war or gradual decline, but through catastrophic flood that swept away the world as it had been. And the way the Sumerians recorded this antediluvian period, the precision with which they documented cities and rulers and impossibly long chronologies, suggested they were not inventing mythology. They were preserving something they believed to be true, copying records that had been passed down to them from a time before their own writing system existed, translating oral traditions or earlier documents into the wedge-shaped script that would outlast the civilization that created it. The names themselves were strange enough. Alulim, Alaljar, Enmenluana, Enmengalana. But it was the numbers beside them that made translators check and recheck their work, certain they had misunderstood the Sumerian counting system. The first king, Alulim of Eridu, was recorded as ruling for 28,800 years. The second, Alaljar, reigned for 36,000 years, 8 kings in total, ruling 5 Sumerian cities, their combined reigns spanning 250,000 years before something the tablets simply called the Flood swept everything away. These were not round numbers, not the vague many years or countless ages of typical mythology. They were specific. Alulim, 28,800 years. Alaljar, 36,000 years. Enmenluana, 43,200 years. The precision itself was unsettling. If these were symbolic numbers meant to convey merely that these kings ruled for a very long time, why not use simpler figures? Why record that Dumuzi, the shepherd, ruled for 36,000 years, while Enmendorana ruled for 21,000 years? The variation suggested these numbers meant something to the scribes who recorded them, that they were copying data they considered factual, even if they no longer understood its true scale or measurement. Modern scholars have proposed numerous explanations for these impossible chronologies. Perhaps they were symbolic, representing not individual rulers but entire dynasties compressed into single names. Perhaps the numbers reflected a different calendar system, measuring months or seasons rather than solar years, though even this adjustment would leave the reigns impossibly long. Perhaps the antediluvian section was pure mythology, a creation story the Sumerians told themselves about a golden age before their own civilization. inflated to cosmic proportions to emphasize the contrast between the divine past and the human present. But none of these explanations fully satisfied, because they couldn't account for the context in which the King List existed. The same scribes who recorded these antediluvian kings, with their impossible reigns, also recorded the post-flood dynasties with much more reasonable chronologies. They documented rulers whose existence could be verified through other sources, whose reign lengths matched what archaeology and cross-referencing with other texts confirmed. These were not people who casually invented numbers or failed to distinguish between myth and history. They were meticulous record keepers who understood the difference between what they had witnessed and what they had inherited from earlier traditions. What's more, the mathematical patterns in the numbers themselves suggested deeper meaning. The reign lengths weren't random. They followed specific relationships to sacred Sumerian numbers, particularly multiples of 600 and 3600. Some researchers noticed that if you applied certain conversion factors, if you interpreted the numbers as units of a different time measurement system, they fell into ranges that might correspond to actual chronological periods, albeit measured in ways we no longer understand. The Sumerians, after all, inherited a base 60 counting system from somewhere, a mathematical framework so sophisticated that we still use it today to measure time and angles. What if they had also inherited a chronological system, a way of measuring deep time that later generations could copy but no longer properly interpret? And there was something else, something that made the impossible numbers harder to dismiss outright. The tablets were specific about where these impossible kings ruled. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar and Shuruppak. 5 cities that existed, the texts insisted, before the waters rose and covered the world. For decades, scholars dismissed these as mythological places, legendary locations that gave ancient prestige to cities that arose much later. But then archaeologists began excavating in southern Iraq, and beneath layer after layer of later settlements, they found the cities exactly where the tablets said they would be, their foundations sinking deep into strata that pushed back the boundaries of known human habitation. Eridu, the first city named in the King List, where Alulim ruled for 28,800 years, lay buried beneath the tell of Abu Sharain near Basra. When excavators reached its lowest levels in the 1920s and 30s, they found not one temple, but 18 successive temples built one atop the ruins of another, stretching back through time like layers in a book written in mud, brick and clay. The earliest of these temples dated to approximately 5500 BC, more than 1,000 years before the Sumerians were supposed to exist as a distinct culture. These structures were built by the mysterious Ubaid people, who left no written records, but whose architectural sophistication and organizational capacity suggested they were far more advanced than simple villagers learning to farm. Bad Tibira, the second city in the list, was discovered at the modern tell of Madain. Excavations revealed occupation layers reaching back into the 5th millennium before Christ. Larak, though less extensively excavated, showed similar antiquity. Sippar, sacred to the sun god Shamash, yielded tablets and temple foundations of extraordinary age. And Shuruppak, the last city before the flood, emerged from the sands at Tel Farah, its name preserved in clay documents that confirmed it as one of the oldest urban centers in Mesopotamia. These were not invented locations attached to mythological kings to give them historical weight. They were real places, ancient beyond the Sumerians' own reckoning. Their foundations laid by people who had built on a scale and with a sophistication that challenged everything archaeologists thought they knew about the development of urban civilization. The cities existed where the King List said they did, in the sequence the text described, with evidence of occupation reaching back thousands of years before the first Sumerian dynasties that history books called the beginning of civilization. If the King List was accurate about the cities, if it correctly recorded their names, their sequence, their geographic locations, what did that mean for the kings themselves? Were they purely mythological figures attached to real places? Or had the Sumerians inherited fragmentary records from those ancient cities, king lists or chronicles, that they preserved as faithfully as they could, copying numbers and names whose original context they no longer fully understood but recognized as too important to discard? The question became more pressing as archaeologists continued to dig, because they kept finding evidence that Eridu, Bad Tibera, and the other antediluvian cities had possessed complex social organization, monumental architecture, and technological achievements that implied they were ruled by someone, organized by some authority that could marshal labor, distribute resources, and maintain the continuity necessary for such long-term construction projects. The Sumerians had another name for the time before the flood. They called it the Age of the Apkallu, which translators rendered as sages, though the word carried connotations that made scholars uncomfortable. These were not merely wise men or learned elders. The text described them as beings who emerged from the waters of the Persian Gulf, bringing with them the knowledge of civilization itself. They taught humanity how to build temples, how to establish cities, how to write and calculate and observe the heavens, and then, when the flood came, they vanished, leaving behind only their teachings and the memory of a time when humanity had needed to be taught how to be human. The Apkallu appeared in multiple Sumerian and later Babylonian texts, always with the same essential characteristics. They were 7 in number, corresponding to the 7 antediluvian cities and kings. They were associated with Enki, the god of wisdom and underground waters, whose temple at Eridu was considered the oldest and most sacred in all of Mesopotamia. And they were described not as gods themselves, but as intermediaries, beings who bridged the gap between divine knowledge and human capability, translating cosmic wisdom into practical instruction that humans could understand and implement. What troubled scholars about these descriptions was how specific they were. The Apkallu weren't generic culture heroes teaching humanity through example or inspiration. Each one had a defined role, a specific area of expertise. The first Apkallu, Adapa, was credited with establishing the rites and rituals of civilization, teaching humans how to organize society through law and religious practice. The second brought knowledge of architecture and construction, showing humans how to build structures that would last, how to calculate angles and distribute weight, how to create spaces that served both practical and sacred purposes. A third taught irrigation and agriculture, revealing the techniques that would transform the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia into the fertile fields that could support cities. Another brought metallurgy, the secrets of working copper and later bronze. One taught calculation and record-keeping, the mathematical and administrative skills necessary for complex urban societies. These weren't vague gifts of wisdom. They were technical training programs, each Apkallu specializing in a different domain of knowledge that civilization required. And the text suggested they came as teachers to people who didn't already possess this knowledge, who needed to be shown how to build, how to farm, how to organize themselves into something beyond scattered hunter-gatherer bands or simple farming villages. In some versions of the story, the Apkallu were depicted as part fish and part human, creatures of the water who could move between the depths and the land. This imagery appeared repeatedly in Mesopotamian art. Figures with fish skin cloaks, or bodies that were human above and fish-like below, carrying tools and tablets shown in poses that suggested instruction and guidance. Were these literal descriptions of non-human teachers, or were they symbolic representations of knowledge that came from across the waters, brought by seafaring people from distant lands who possessed skills and understanding that the local population lacked? The text didn't clarify, preserving only the essential claim. Before the flood, there were beings who taught humanity everything it needed to build civilization, and after the flood, those beings were gone, leaving humans to maintain and develop what they had learned. The connection between the Apkallu and the antediluvian kings created a narrative framework that scholars found difficult to categorize. It wasn't quite mythology, because it lacked the dramatic divine conflicts and supernatural events that characterize Mesopotamian religious epics. It wasn't quite history, because it described beings who weren't quite human, teaching people who would later become human civilizations. It existed in a liminal space, a preserved memory of knowledge transfer that the Sumerians themselves seemed to regard as foundational to their identity. They were not the first, they were the inheritors. They were the students of teachers who had come before, and their responsibility was to preserve what they had been given. Among all the gods in the Sumerian pantheon, one stood apart in his relationship to human civilization. Enki, whose name meant Lord of the Earth, was credited not with creating humanity, but with giving humanity the tools to rise above mere survival. The text described him as the keeper of the me, a Sumerian concept that translators struggled to render in modern languages: divine decrees, sacred powers, the fundamental principles that allowed civilization to function. Enki, the tablet said, took these me and gave them to humanity, teaching the first people not just to exist, but to build, to grow, to preserve knowledge across generations. The me were central to Sumerian thought, appearing in text after text as the essential components of civilized life. Lists of me varied slightly across different sources, but they generally included over 100 specific elements: kingship, priesthood, truth and falsehood, the art of metalworking, writing, music, sexual intercourse, prostitution, law, architecture, weaving, brewing beer. They ranged from the most exalted concepts to the most practical skills, from religious authority to technical crafts, from social institutions to artistic expression. And they were described not as abstract ideas, but as things that could be possessed, transferred, even stolen. One of the most revealing myths about the me involved the goddess Inanna, who decided that her city of Uruk needed these divine principles to achieve greatness. She travelled to Eridu, Enki's sacred city, where the temple sat on the very foundations where the Apkallu had first taught humans how to build. Inanna found Enki at his shrine, and she plied him with beer, the drink that loosens tongues and clouds judgment. When Enki was drunk, Inanna persuaded him to give her the me. She loaded them onto her boat and sailed back toward Uruk. When Enki sobered and realized what he had done, he sent demons to pursue her and retrieve the me. But Inanna's servant Ninshubur fought them off. Inanna brought the me to Uruk, and the city became great. The story was often read as a humorous tale about gods behaving badly, but embedded within it was a serious concept. Knowledge and civilization were portable. They could be transferred from one place to another, and they existed in some form that could be carried, possessed, and installed in a new location. The me weren't innate human qualities that developed naturally. They were external, transmissible, capable of being given and received. This was how the Sumerians conceptualized cultural knowledge itself, as something that had been brought to humanity from outside, that had been taught rather than discovered, that humans maintained but hadn't originated. Enki's role in Sumerian theology reinforced this idea of a knowledge transfer. Unlike other gods who ruled through power or demanded worship through fear, Enki was portrayed as humanity's advocate, the divine figure who consistently worked to preserve human civilization even when other gods sought to destroy it. When the gods decided to send the flood to wipe out humanity, it was Enki who warned Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah, telling him to build a boat and preserve the seeds of all living things. When humanity needed knowledge to survive and thrive, it was Enki who provided it, either directly or through his Apkallu emissaries. This theological framework suggested that the Sumerians understood their civilization not as something they had invented from scratch, but as something they had received, learned, inherited from teachers who had lived before the flood that divided the world into before and after. And if those teachers had been real, if the Apkallu were not just mythological figures, but represented some actual tradition of knowledge transfer, then the question became, who taught the teachers? Where did the me originally come from? Who possessed this knowledge before it was given to the first humans who would build Eridu and the other antediluvian cities? The tablets offered no clear answer, only the persistent claim that there had been a time before human civilization as the Sumerians knew it, a time when the knowledge that made cities possible existed somewhere else, possessed by someone else, waiting to be transferred to humanity. And that transfer, that moment when beings from the waters brought knowledge to people living in the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia, mark the true beginning of the story the Sumerians believed they were living through, inheritors of a tradition that stretched back beyond memory into a past they could no longer clearly see, but refused to forget. When archaeologist Samuel Noah Kramer first translated what would become known as the Eridu Genesis in the 1930s, he found himself reading what he initially took for a version of the biblical flood narrative. But this text was older, much older, and its details suggested something more complex than simple myth-making. The tablet described a time when cities were first established, when kingship was first lowered from heaven, and then a decision made by the gods to destroy humanity with a deluge. One man, Ziusudra, was warned to build a boat. 7 days and 7 nights the storm raged, and when it ended the world had to begin again. The tablet itself was fragmentary, damaged by the millennia it had spent buried beneath the ruins of Nippur. Kramer worked slowly, comparing his fragment with other partial texts, reconstructing the narrative piece by piece like assembling a puzzle where most of the pieces were missing. What emerged was a creation story unlike others in the ancient Near East. It didn't begin with gods battling chaos or shaping humans from clay as an afterthought. It began with civilization already established, with cities already functioning, with humanity already organized under kings who ruled by divine mandate. The text described how Nintur, the mother goddess, created humanity, how the gods established the 5 antediluvian cities, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. How kingship was lowered from heaven to Eridu, the first city. Then, after a lacuna in the tablet where text had been lost, the narrative jumped to a divine council where the gods decided that humanity had become too numerous, too noisy, too troublesome. The solution was flood, complete destruction, a return to the silence before city existed. But one god objected. Enki, keeper of wisdom, protector of humanity, refused to let civilization be completely erased. He couldn't openly defy the other gods' decision, but he found a way around it. He spoke to a wall, knowing that Ziusudra, the king of Shuruppak, was listening on the other side. Through this clever stratagem, Enki warned Ziusudra without technically breaking the divine decree. He instructed the king to build a boat, to make it watertight with bitumen, to load it with the seeds of all living things, with breeding pairs of animals, with everything necessary to rebuild after the waters receded. The flood came. 7 days and 7 nights, the text said. The storm winds blew, the waters rose, everything outside the boat was swept away. And when the waters finally subsided, when Ziusudra emerged and made offerings to the gods, he was granted eternal life as a reward for preserving what civilization would need to begin again. The gods regretted their destruction. They realized that without humanity, there was no one to maintain the temples, no one to make offerings, no one to perform the rituals that kept the cosmic order functioning. Humanity and the gods needed each other. What made the Eridu Genesis particularly intriguing was its matter-of-fact tone. This wasn't presented as a cosmic battle between good and evil, or as divine punishment for human sin. It was described almost bureaucratically. Cities existed. The gods decided to destroy them. One god found a loophole to preserve civilization. The flood happened. Everything started over. The narrative treated the antediluvian cities as historical fact, their destruction as a real event that required explanation, and the survival of civilization as something that had to be consciously engineered, not something that happened automatically. Kramer recognized that this text, fragmentary as it was, represented the oldest version of the flood story then known. It predated the Babylonian Gilgamesh epic by centuries. It was clearly the ancestor of the biblical Noah narrative, the source from which later flood stories had borrowed their basic structure. But unlike those later versions, which had been adapted and modified to fit different theological frameworks, the Eridu Genesis preserved details that felt older, more specific, less refined into universal moral lessons. It named actual cities. It specified the duration of the flood with precision. It described practical survival strategies, bitumen for waterproofing, seeds and animals for rebuilding. These details suggested the story originated in a place and time when such information mattered, when people knew what a catastrophic flood looked like and understood what would be needed to survive one. In 1929, Leonard Woolley was excavating the royal tombs at Ur when his workers struck a layer of water-laid silt 8 feet thick, devoid of any artifacts or evidence of human habitation. Below this sterile layer lay the remains of an earlier settlement. Above it, a new culture had begun. Woolley, convinced he had found evidence of Noah's flood, announced his discovery to tremendous fanfare. Other excavations across Mesopotamia found similar flood deposits, though not always at the same depth or date. What emerged was a picture not of one catastrophic deluge, but of recurring floods that periodically devastated the region. each one possibly preserved in cultural memory as the flood that divided the world into before and after. Woolley's discovery electrified the archaeological community. Here was physical evidence, he claimed, of the biblical deluge, the great flood that had destroyed the world and required humanity to start over. The newspapers ran dramatic headlines. Religious authorities pointed to the discovery as confirmation of Scripture's historical accuracy. For a brief moment, it seemed that archaeology had vindicated ancient tradition, proving that the flood stories weren't myths, but memories of an actual catastrophe. But as other archaeologists examined Woolley's evidence and conducted their own excavations across southern Mesopotamia, a more complex picture emerged. At the flood layer dated to approximately 3800 BC. But at Kish, another ancient city, excavators found a different flood layer dating to around 3500 BC. At Shuruppak, the city that the Eridu Genesis specifically named as Ziusudra's home, the flood deposit dated to approximately 2900 BC. At Nineveh in the north, flood layers appeared at still different chronological horizons. Each city seemed to have its own flood, its own moment of catastrophic inundation, but these events weren't synchronous. They hadn't all happened at the same time. What archaeologists were discovering was the reality of Mesopotamian geography. The land between the rivers was fundamentally unstable. The Tigris and Euphrates regularly changed course, sometimes gradually over centuries, sometimes suddenly during periods of extreme flooding. Cities that depended on these rivers for irrigation and drinking water could be devastated when the rivers shifted, their canal systems rendered useless, their fields turning to desert or swamp. Catastrophic floods were not rare events, but recurring disasters that periodically reshaped the landscape and forced populations to relocate, rebuild, or abandon settlements entirely. Each major flood would have been remembered by the people who survived it as the flood, the catastrophe that divided their world into before and after. Over generations, these separate memories might have merged, creating a composite narrative of a single great deluge that destroyed the world before the current civilization. The Eridu Genesis might have been preserving not one specific flood event, but the collective memory of recurring catastrophes distilled into a narrative framework that made sense of why civilization had to keep starting over, why the cities the Sumerians knew were built on the ruins of earlier settlements, why their own origins felt discontinuous, as if something had been lost and then partially recovered. But some flood deposits were more dramatic than others. The layer at that Woolley had found wasn't just evidence of normal riverine flooding. 8 feet of sterile silt suggested an inundation of extraordinary scale and duration, the kind of event that would have erased not just buildings but entire communities, leaving survivors with the massive task of rebuilding everything from foundational principles. And when researchers began comparing these various flood deposits with climate data from ice cores and sediment analysis, they found evidence of several periods of increased rainfall and catastrophic flooding across the region between 4500 and 2500 BC, during the very period when civilization was supposed to be developing in Mesopotamia. The floods were real, multiple floods, separated by centuries, each one devastating enough to destroy cities and force survivors to relocate and rebuild. And embedded in Sumerian cultural memory was the recognition that civilization itself was fragile, that knowledge could be lost, that what had been learned once might need to be learned again after catastrophe swept everything away. This was perhaps why the Sumerians placed such emphasis on writing, on preserving knowledge in clay tablets that could survive fire and water, on copying and recopying important texts to ensure they would outlast any single generation or any single disaster. Beneath every Sumerian city, archaeologists found something unexpected. An earlier culture, sophisticated in its own right, that had occupied southern Mesopotamia for nearly 2,000 years before the Sumerians appeared in the historical record. They called these people the Ubaid culture, named after the tell where their distinctive pottery was first identified. The Ubaid built substantial houses, established extensive trade networks, and created the first temples at sites like Eridu that would later become Sumerian sacred centres. But they left no written records, no names, no kings. They simply vanished from history, replaced by the Sumerians, who seemed to emerge fully formed, already literate, already organised into city-states. The Ubaid period stretched from approximately 6500 BC to approximately 3800 BC, a span of nearly 3 millennia during which this culture dominated southern Mesopotamia and extended its influence across the Persian Gulf region. Their pottery was distinctive, painted with geometric designs in dark pigment on light clay. Their shapes standardized across vast distances, suggesting either trade networks or population movements that spread Ubaid culture far beyond its point of origin. At sites from Kuwait to Syria, archaeologists found Ubaid pottery, evidence of a cultural sphere that connected the entire region centuries before the Sumerians emerged. But it was their architecture that truly impressed excavators. Ubaid houses were substantial structures built of mud brick, with multiple rooms organised around central courtyards. They showed sophisticated understanding of climate control, with thick walls that insulated against summer heat and architectural features that promoted air circulation. Some houses included what appeared to be private shrines, small rooms with platforms or altars suggesting that religious practice was already embedded in domestic life. These weren't simple farmers living in temporary shelters. These were sedentary communities with complex social organisation and the resources to invest in permanent, carefully planned construction. Even more impressive were the temples. At Eridu, the site the Sumerians would later call the first city, Ubaid people built a sequence of temples beginning around 5500 BC. These weren't crude shrines or simple gathering places. They were monumental structures raised on platforms, with central chambers and subsidiary rooms, following architectural plans that would be elaborated and refined over the following millennia, but whose basic elements were already present in these earliest versions. Someone had decided that a particular spot in the landscape was sacred, and generation after generation they returned to that exact location, building new temples atop the ruins of old ones, maintaining the sanctity of the place across spans of time that stretched beyond living memory. The Ubaid also established extensive trade networks. Excavations of their sites revealed imported materials, obsidian from Anatolia, carnelian beads from the Indus region, copper from sources in Iran or Arabia. This wasn't the simple exchange of neighbouring villages, but long-distance commerce that required organisational sophistication, standardised exchange rates or barter systems, and the social stability to maintain trading relationships across generations. The Ubaid were connected to a world much larger than their local environment, participating in exchange networks that span the ancient Near East. And then they disappeared. Not suddenly, not through catastrophic conquest or abandonment, but through gradual transformation. The latest Ubaid levels showed changes in pottery styles, shifts in architectural techniques, the appearance of new artifact types. By 3800 BC, the culture that had dominated southern Mesopotamia for 3,000 years was being replaced by something else. The Uruk period was beginning, and with it came the civilization that would eventually identify itself as Sumerian. But the transition wasn't clean. For several centuries, the archaeological record showed mixed assemblages, sites with both Ubaid and Uruk characteristics, as if two populations were coexisting, intermingling, perhaps one gradually absorbing or displacing the other. What happened to the Ubaid people? Did they evolve into the Sumerians, their culture transforming so completely that later generations wouldn't recognize the connection? Were they displaced by newcomers who adopted some Ubaid traditions while introducing their own innovations? The archaeology couldn't provide clear answers, only the puzzling fact that a sophisticated, long-lived culture had preceded the Sumerians in precisely the locations where Sumerian civilization would flourish. That the Ubaid had already identified Eridu as sacred, already built temples on the sites where Sumerian temples would later rise, already established the urban pattern that the Sumerians would inherit and expand. Of all the Sumerian cities, Eridu held a special place in their mythology and their memory. The tablets called it the first city, the place where kingship first descended from heaven, where the first temple was built to honor Enki, lord of the underground waters. When archaeologists excavated the Tell at Abu Sharain in the early 20th century, they found not one temple, but 18, each built directly atop the ruins of its predecessor, stretching back through time. The earliest of these temples dated to approximately 5500 BC, more than 1,000 years before Sumerian writing appeared, built by the mysterious Ubaid people who left no records of their names or their purposes. The excavation of Eridu revealed something that archaeologists had never seen before at such an ancient site: continuity of spanning millennia. At most ancient tells, excavation revealed layers of different occupations, each with its own character, sometimes building on earlier remains, but just as often clearing them away to make space for new construction. But at Eridu, the temple site showed deliberate, careful maintenance of a sacred location across time spans that exceeded the lifespans of entire civilizations. Each time a temple fell into disrepair or needed expansion, the builders filled in the old structure with clean sand, creating a platform on which to build the new temple directly above where the old one had stood. The earliest temple, labelled Temple 1 by excavators, was a small structure, barely 10 meters by 15, but its plan already showed the essential elements that would characterize Mesopotamian temples for the next 4,000 years. A central chamber with an altar or offering table at one end, subsidiary rooms on either side, an entrance that required visitors to turn a corner before entering the main space, creating a sense of progression from the secular world outside to the sacred space within. This wasn't a tentative first attempt at religious architecture. It was a fully realized design that suggested the builders already understood what a temple should be, already possessed a template they were implementing in mud, brick and reed. Temple 2 through Temple 7 showed gradual elaboration of the basic plan. Each was larger than its predecessor, with more rooms, more sophisticated architectural details, but always maintaining the same orientation, the same basic relationship between central chamber and subsidiary spaces. By Temple 8, built around 4500 BC, the structure had grown to nearly 30 meters long, raised on a substantial platform that lifted it above the surrounding landscape, making it visible from a distance as a marker of sacred space. Then came a curious gap. Temple 9 through 12 showed signs of hasty construction, smaller than their predecessors, built with less care. Archaeologists speculated that these represented a period of decline or disruption, perhaps corresponding to the climate deterioration and possible flooding that other sites showed during this period. But then Temple 13 marked a renaissance. It was massive, carefully planned, built on a platform that required enormous labour investment, and it was built in a new style, showing characteristics that mark the transition from Ubaid to Uruk period, from the mysterious earlier culture to the civilization that would become recognisably Sumerian. The later temples, 14 through 18, continued this pattern of increasingly monumental construction, each one more elaborate than the last, until the final temple was a ziggurat-like structure that would have dominated the landscape for miles around. And through all these reconstructions across more than 3,000 years of continuous use, the sacred spot remained the same. Some belief, some tradition, some understanding that this particular place mattered kept people returning, generation after generation, investing their labour and resources in maintaining a temple to Enki at the exact location where the first Ubaid builders had established his shrine. The Sumerians remembered this continuity. Their texts insisted that Eridu was the first city, that kingship descended from heaven there before anywhere else, that this was where civilization began. And the archaeology confirmed that if any place could claim to be the origin point of Mesopotamian urban civilization, it was Eridu. But the archaeology also revealed something the Sumerian texts didn't explicitly say, that Eridu's sacredness preceded the Sumerians themselves, that the Ubaid people had already identified this location as holy more than 1,000 years before Sumerian writing existed to record why it mattered. There is a mystery in the dust layers of ancient Iraq that archaeologists call the Uruk period gap. Around 4200 BC, settlement patterns across northern Mesopotamia show a dramatic shift. Sites that had been occupied for centuries were abandoned. The population seemed to contract southward, consolidating in the region that would become Sumer. For several centuries, the archaeological record thins, becomes harder to read, and then, around 3500 BC, everything explodes. Cities suddenly dot the landscape. Writing appears. Complex administrative systems emerge. The Sumerian civilization materializes as if from nowhere, but their own records insisted they were not the first, merely the inheritors of something older. The gap wasn't total. Some sites in the north maintained occupation, and the south showed continuity of settlement through the Ubaid into the Uruk period. But the pattern was striking enough that archaeologists struggled to explain it. Climate data suggested this was a period of increased aridity, when rainfall patterns shifted and reliable water sources became scarcer. Sites that had depended on rain-fed agriculture or seasonal streams would have become less viable, forcing populations to relocate to areas where permanent rivers could support irrigation agriculture. The move south toward the Tigris and Euphrates would have been a survival strategy, a response to environmental pressure. But something else happened during this consolidation, something that went beyond simple population movement. Around 3500 BC, the archaeological record suddenly showed evidence of dramatic innovation. Monumental architecture on a scale never before attempted. cylinder seals and stamp seals for marking ownership and recording transactions, mass-produced pottery made on wheels rather than hand-formed, and most dramatically the first writing. Not primitive proto-writing or simple pictographs, but a fully functional system capable of recording complex information, maintaining accounts across time, preserving knowledge in permanent form. This constellation of innovations appeared within a span of a few centuries, sometimes seemingly all at once at sites like Uruk, the city that would give this period its name. Archaeologists called it the urban revolution, but that term implied a gradual process of development. What the archaeology actually showed looked less like gradual revolution and more like sudden crystallization, as if all the elements necessary for complex urban civilization had been present but dormant, waiting for the right conditions to coalesce into the cities and institutions that would define Mesopotamian civilization for the next 3,000 years. The Sumerians' own explanation for this sudden emergence was simple. Kingship descended from heaven to Eridu, and from there spread to the other cities. Knowledge was given, not gradually developed. Civilization was inherited from the Apkallu, the 7 sages who had taught humanity before the flood. The Sumerians saw themselves as recipients and preservers of a tradition that preceded them, and they organized their entire culture around maintaining and transmitting that inherited knowledge to future generations. Modern archaeology struggled with this narrative because it contradicted the expected pattern of cultural development. But the more archaeologists excavated, the more they found evidence that didn't fit the gradual development model. The earliest Sumerian writing wasn't crude or experimental. It was already sophisticated, capable of expressing complex ideas and maintaining detailed records. The earliest monumental architecture didn't show tentative experimentation, but confident execution of ambitious plans. The earliest administrative systems weren't simple, but remarkably complex, tracking multiple types of goods across large territories. Either the Sumerians had compressed centuries of development into a few generations of rapid innovation, or they had inherited foundational knowledge from the Ubaid culture that preceded them, or perhaps from somewhere else entirely, adapting and elaborating traditions whose origins they themselves might not have fully understood, but recognized as essential to preserve. 900 miles northwest of Sumer, atop a limestone plateau in southeastern Turkey, archaeologists in 1994 uncovered something that would fundamentally challenge our understanding of prehistoric humanity. Göbekli Tepe, with its massive T-shaped pillars carved with images of animals and abstract symbols, dated to approximately 9600 BC, more than 6,000 years before the first Sumerian cities. It was built by hunter-gatherers, people who supposedly lacked the organization and resources to create monumental architecture. The site's very existence suggested that complex organized societies had risen and fallen long before the civilizations we called first. And if Göbekli Tepe could exist, what else might have been lost in the millennia before writing preserved human memory? The discovery happened almost by accident. A local shepherd noticed stones jutting from the hilltop and mentioned them to researchers conducting a survey of the region. When German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt arrived to investigate, he initially assumed he would find a medieval cemetery or perhaps a Byzantine fortress. Instead, his test excavations revealed something that shouldn't have existed. Massive carved pillars arranged in circular enclosures, buried deliberately beneath tons of fill, preserved for nearly 12,000 years beneath the earth. The pillars themselves were extraordinary achievements. Some stood over 15 feet tall and weighed more than 10 tons. They were carved from limestone quarried at the site, shaped into T-forms that suggested abstract human figures, their surfaces covered with detailed bas reliefs depicting foxes, lions, bulls, scorpions, snakes, and birds. The artistry was sophisticated, showing mastery of stone carving techniques and an aesthetic sensibility that created compositions of remarkable beauty and power. These were not crude first attempts at monumental art. They were accomplished works that suggested a long tradition of craftsmanship had already existed, though no earlier examples have been found. But what truly stunned archaeologists was the date. Radiocarbon analysis of organic materials from the earliest layers consistently returned dates around 9600 BC, placing Göbekli Tepe firmly in the pre-pottery Neolithic A period, a time when humans were supposedly living in small nomadic bands, following animal herds and gathering wild plants. These people had not yet domesticated animals. They had not yet cultivated grain on any significant scale. They lived, according to everything archaeology thought it knew, in a world without the social complexity or economic surplus needed to undertake massive construction projects. Yet here at Göbekli Tepe, these supposedly simple hunter-gatherers had quarried, carved, transported and erected massive pillars, arranging them in carefully planned circular enclosures that required surveying skills and architectural knowledge. They had coordinated labour on a scale that implied social hierarchies and organisational structures, feeding and housing work crews, maintaining the site across generations. And they had done all this not for practical purposes like defence or food storage, but apparently for ritual or ceremonial reasons, creating a space dedicated to purposes we can only guess at from the symbolism carved into the stones. The implications rippled through archaeology like shockwaves. If complex monumental architecture could exist this early, created by people who lived before the supposed prerequisites for civilization had been met, then the entire narrative of how civilization developed needed revision. Perhaps social complexity didn't require agriculture and settled life. Perhaps monumental construction came before cities, not after. Perhaps the drive to create sacred spaces, to mark the landscape with permanent structures that proclaimed meaning and purpose, was not a late development of complex societies, but a fundamental human impulse that preceded and maybe even motivated the shift to settled agricultural life. And if this could happen at Göbekli Tepe in 9600 BC, what else might have existed during the millennia between that time and the emergence of Sumerian civilization around 3500 BC? 6,000 years separated Göbekli Tepe from the first Sumerian cities. That was more time than separates the Sumerians from us. During that vast span, how many other sites like Göbekli Tepe might have existed? How many societies might have achieved levels of complexity that left no written records because writing hadn't been invented yet, whose monuments were buried or destroyed or simply haven't been found yet? The discovery of Göbekli Tepe opened a window into a prehistoric world far more complex and sophisticated than anyone had imagined. A world where the seeds of civilization might have been planted and replanted multiple times across millennia before finally taking root in the river valleys of Mesopotamia. When the Sumerians recorded their king list with its antediluvian rulers and its claims of kingship descending from heaven, when they described the Apkallu teaching, humanity, the arts of civilization, were they preserving distant memories of predecessors like the builders of Göbekli Tepe? People who had achieved something remarkable, something that required organization and vision and technical skill, but whose accomplishments were lost when their societies collapsed or transformed, leaving only fragments of memory that later cultures would preserve in the form of myths about divine teachers and golden ages before the flood. Linguistics reveals another curious aspect of Sumerian origins. The language itself is an isolate, meaning it has no known relatives, no linguistic family to trace its evolution through. It appeared in written form already fully developed, with a complex grammar and a sophisticated vocabulary. Scholars have searched for centuries for connections to other language families, but Sumerian stands alone, as if it emerged from nowhere or descended from a linguistic tradition that left no other traces. Even more curious, many Sumerian religious and technical terms appear to be borrowed from an even older language, one that linguists call substrate, visible only in the linguistic fossils preserved in Sumerian texts. When linguists first began studying Sumerian in the late 19th century, they assumed it must belong to some known language family. Perhaps it was related to the Semitic languages like Akkadian that eventually replaced it in Mesopotamia. Perhaps it had connections to languages of the Caucasus or Central Asia. Scholars proposed theories connecting Sumerian to Turkish, to Hungarian, to Dravidian languages of India, to nearly every language family that existed in the general region. But none of the proposed connections held up to scrutiny. Sumerian grammar functioned differently from all of them. Its vocabulary showed no systematic correspondences with other languages. Its structure was unique. This linguistic isolation was deeply puzzling because languages don't normally exist in complete isolation. Every known language belongs to a family, shows relationships to neighbouring languages through borrowed vocabulary or shared grammatical features, reveals its history through the traces of earlier forms preserved in daughter languages or related tongues. But Sumerian showed none of this. It appeared in the written record around 3200 BC already fully formed, with no evidence of earlier stages of development, no related languages to suggest where it came from, no clear path of evolution from simpler to more complex forms. The grammar itself was sophisticated, using a system of prefixes, suffixes, and infixes that could build complex verbal forms from simple roots. Sumerian could express subtle distinctions of tense, mood, person, and number through these grammatical elements, creating a flexible system capable of conveying precise meanings. This wasn't a primitive language struggling to express complex ideas. It was a mature linguistic system that had clearly been refined over a long period of development, yet that period of development left no traces, no intermediate stages, no evidence of the gradual evolution that languages typically undergo. But what truly troubled linguists were the anomalies within Sumerian vocabulary itself. Certain words, particularly those related to agriculture, crafts, and religious practice, didn't follow normal Sumerian phonological patterns. They contained sound combinations that were unusual for Sumerian, used structures that felt borrowed rather than native. Linguists began to realize that many fundamental Sumerian terms were loanwords from an earlier language, a language that had existed in Mesopotamia before Sumerian, but left no texts of its own. They called this phantom language the substrate, visible only in the words it had contributed to Sumerian. Terms for farmer, metalworker, potter, weaver, and priest all showed characteristics of substrate borrowing. So did words for major geographical features and even the names of some cities. The implications were significant. When the Sumerian-speaking people arrived in southern Mesopotamia, they encountered an existing population with its own language, a people who already had words for farming and crafts because they were already farmers and craftspeople. The Sumerians adopted these terms along with the technologies and practices they described, preserving in their language evidence of the people who had been there first. The Ubaid culture, that mysterious predecessor that had built the first temples at Eridu and occupied southern Mesopotamia for 2,000 years before the Sumerians emerged, might have spoken this substrate language. When the Ubaid culture was gradually replaced by or transformed into Sumerian civilization, their language would have been absorbed, its most essential terms preserved even as the language as a whole disappeared. The substrate words in Sumerian might be the only surviving traces of the Ubaid language, linguistic fossils preserved in the vocabulary of their successors. This pattern of linguistic replacement suggested cultural discontinuity, even as some elements of the earlier culture were preserved. The Sumerians weren't simply the Ubaid people who had learned to write. They were a distinct population that had arrived in Mesopotamia and merged with or displaced the existing inhabitants, adopting some of their technologies and vocabulary while bringing their own language and perhaps their own traditions. The synthesis created something new, but that new culture retained memories and vocabulary from what came before, fragments that hinted at the lost people who had first made southern Mesopotamia suitable for civilization. The Sumerian concept of me troubled translators from the moment they first encountered it in ancient texts. These were not abstract principles or spiritual concepts, but things that could be possessed, transferred, even stolen. One myth describes the goddess Inanna travelling to Eridu and tricking Enki into giving her the me while he was drunk on beer. She then loaded them onto her boat and sailed back to Uruk, bringing civilization to her city. The texts list over 100 specific me: kingship, priesthood, truth-telling, metalworking, writing, music. They were described with a concreteness of physical objects, as if knowledge itself had once existed in tangible form, passed from the divine to the human realm. The way Sumerians talked about the me defied modern categories of thought. They weren't laws, though they included concepts like justice and governance. They weren't technologies, though they encompassed crafts like metalworking and weaving. They weren't purely religious, though they included priesthood and ritual. They were something else, something for which we have no exact equivalent. The fundamental principles that made civilization possible, conceptualized not as abstract ideas, but as transferable possessions that could be acquired, lost, or stolen. In the myth of Inanna and Enki, the narrative treated the me with startling materiality. Inanna wanted to elevate her city of Uruk, to give it the cultural sophistication and religious authority that Eridu possessed. So she travelled to Eridu, where Enki kept the me in his temple. She found the god at his shrine, and being clever, she engaged him in drinking beer, the beverage that the Sumerians believed loosened inhibitions and clouded judgment. As Enki became increasingly drunk, Inanna persuaded him to give her the me, one by one. He handed them over, and she loaded them onto her boat. When Enki sobered and realized what he had done, he sent his demons to pursue Inanna and retrieve the me before she could reach Uruk. But Inanna's vizier, Ninshubur, fought off each wave of pursuers, and Inanna successfully brought the me to Uruk. Once they were installed in her city, they could not be taken back. Uruk became great. The city gained the cultural and religious authority it had lacked, all because Inanna had successfully acquired the me that Enki had possessed. The story is often read as a humorous tale about divine personalities and the transfer of cultural primacy from one city to another. But embedded within it was a serious conceptual framework. Civilization was not something humans invented gradually through trial and error. It existed as a defined set of principles, the emei, that had to be acquired and maintained. These principles were originally kept at Eridu, the first city where Enki guarded them. Other cities gained civilized status by acquiring these me, either through legitimate transfer or, as in Inanna's case, through clever theft. The me themselves were listed in various texts, and the list revealed how comprehensively the Sumerians had analysed the components of civilized life. Kingship was a me, so was priesthood, but so were more specific things: the craft of the smith, the craft of the carpenter, the craft of the scribe. Truth-telling was a me, so was falsehood. Music, art, and sexual intercourse were me. Warfare, victory and defeat were me. The destruction of cities was a me. Everything that characterized human civilization, both its glories and its darknesses, existed as one of these fundamental principles that gods possessed and humans received. This conceptualization suggested that the Sumerians understood civilization as something external to human nature, something that had to be learned and maintained rather than something that emerged naturally from human societies. It aligned with their narrative about the Apkallu, the 7 sages who emerged from the waters to teach humanity. The Apkallu brought the me, or perhaps more accurately, they taught humans how to properly use and maintain the me that the gods were willing to share. Civilization was a gift, a transmission of knowledge from those who possessed it to those who needed to learn it. What puzzled scholars most about the Sumerian King List's antediluvian section was not just the impossible lifespans, but their mathematical pattern. The reign lengths were not random. They followed specific numerical relationships, multiples of the sacred Sumerian numbers 3 and 600. Some scholars argued this proved the numbers were symbolic, mythological, not meant to be taken as literal history. But others noticed something curious. If you divided these reign lengths by a consistent factor, if you interpreted them not as years but as units of a different time scale, they fell into ranges that matched archaeological estimates for how long early settlements might have persisted before being abandoned or destroyed. What if the numbers weren't invented but misunderstood? What if they represented real chronologies recorded in a counting system later generations could no longer properly interpret? The mathematical structure of the antediluvian reigns was undeniable. Alulim's 28,800 years was divisible by 600. Alaljar's 36,000 years was exactly 60 times 600. Enmenluana's 43,200 years followed similar patterns. The numbers weren't arbitrary. They were constructed according to mathematical principles that mattered to the Sumerians, built from their sacred numbers that appeared throughout their culture, in contexts from astronomy to architecture. Some scholars argued this mathematical structure proved the numbers were mythological constructs, symbolic representations of cosmic time rather than historical chronologies. The Sumerians, according to this interpretation, were using numbers the way poets use metaphors, to convey scale and importance rather than precise measurement. The enormous reigns indicated that these were beings of a different order than mortal humans, rulers whose time belonged to the mythological past rather than historical record. But other researchers weren't satisfied with this explanation. If the numbers were purely symbolic, why were they different from each other? Why not simply say each king ruled countless years, or assign them all the same impossibly long reign? The variation suggested the numbers meant something specific, that they were recording actual data even if that data had been transformed in transmission. Some scholars began experimenting with different conversion factors, trying to find a consistent interpretation that would make the numbers meaningful. One intriguing possibility emerged when researchers considered that the numbers might have been recorded in a different timescale and then mistranslated by later scribes who no longer understood the original system. If the reign lengths were measured not in solar years but in lunar months, the numbers became somewhat more reasonable, though still impossibly long. If they measured something else entirely, perhaps periods defined by astronomical cycles or seasonal counts, they might fall into historically plausible ranges. A reign of 28,800 years might actually represent 28,800 days, or roughly 79 solar years, a long but humanly possible reign. Other conversions produced different but still plausible results. The problem was that no single conversion factor worked consistently for all the reigns. Each number would require a different interpretation to produce historically reasonable results, which suggested that if the numbers were based on actual chronologies, the system used to measure them was more complex than simple calendar conversion. Perhaps the antediluvian king's reign lengths were measured in multiple different ways depending on the source of the information, and later scribes, compiling these various sources into a single document, recorded all the numbers in the same format without realizing they represented different types of measurements. Another possibility emerged from archaeological evidence. The time spans between major cultural transitions at sites like Eridu, the periods during which a particular temple or settlement pattern persisted before being replaced by something new, sometimes lasted for centuries. If the King List's reign lengths represented not individual rulers but entire cultural phases or dynasties, each king symbolizing a period of relatively stable settlement and governance, then the numbers might be recording actual chronological durations, just not in the way later interpreters assumed. 28,800 years might represent a cultural phase that lasted several centuries, its duration measured in some counting unit that later scribes interpreted as years when they were actually months, or seasons, or some other temporal division. The question remained unresolved, but the very fact that serious scholars continued to wrestle with it revealed something important. The numbers couldn't be dismissed simply as mythological fancy, because they were embedded in a document that also contained verifiable historical information, because they showed mathematical structure suggesting they meant something specific, and because the cities and cultural context they described were real, confirmed by archaeology. Among the most haunting artifacts recovered from Sumerian sites are the cylinder seals, small stone cylinders carved with intricate scenes that, when rolled across wet clay, left detailed impressions. The images they preserved were sometimes mundane, recording transactions or identifying ownership, but others showed scenes that scholars struggled to interpret, figures that appeared human but possessed wings or animal heads, standing before structures or symbols whose meanings had been lost. Some seals showed what looked like astronomical observations, star patterns, or celestial events. Others depicted what might have been historical scenes, or might have been mythology, or might have been memories of something that actually happened in a time before writing could record it clearly. The cylinder seals appeared early in Sumerian culture and quickly became ubiquitous. Every administrative document, every clay envelope containing tablets, every container of goods bore the impression of someone's seal, serving as a signature or mark of authenticity. The seals were personal possessions, often buried with their owners, and the designs carved into them range from simple geometric patterns to elaborate narrative scenes covering every inch of the cylinder's surface. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, working with hard stones like lapis lazuli, carnelian, or hematite. Using copper tools and abrasive powders, seal cutters created miniature artworks in reverse and in negative, carving images that would only reveal their true form when rolled onto clay. The level of skill required to achieve the detail visible in the finest seals, the ability to create complex compositions on a surface barely an inch tall and 2 inches in circumference, suggested specialized artisans who had trained for years in their craft. But it was the content of the images that truly fascinated researchers. Many seals showed what appeared to be religious or mythological scenes, figures approaching gods, rituals being performed, supernatural beings interacting with humans. The imagery was rich with symbolism that scholars could sometimes decode based on later texts. A figure with water streams flowing from his shoulders was Enki, god of wisdom and underground waters. A goddess with weapons rising from her back was Inanna, goddess of love and war. Lions, bulls, and eagles carried divine associations that the Sumerians would have recognized immediately. But other seals showed images that defied easy interpretation, figures that combined human and animal characteristics in ways that didn't match known deities, architectural structures that looked like nothing found in Sumerian remains, scenes that appeared to depict historical events but couldn't be matched to any known myths or legends. Some seals showed what looked like astronomical configurations, stars or planets arranged in specific patterns, perhaps recording actual celestial events, or perhaps representing symbolic cosmic orders. One category of seals particularly troubled scholars, those showing what appeared to be technological knowledge or scenes of instruction. Some depicted figures using tools or instruments whose purposes weren't clear. Others showed what looked like teaching scenes, one figure instructing another, sometimes before arrays of objects or symbols that might represent knowledge being transmitted. Were these depictions of the Apkallu teaching humans? Were they symbolic representations of knowledge transfer? Or were they recording actual practices, actual tools, actual methods of instruction that the Sumerians used but that we no longer recognize? The seals also revealed something about how the Sumerians thought about their past. Some seals were themselves ancient when the Sumerians found them, created by the Ubaid culture or even earlier peoples. But the Sumerians continued to use these older seals, valued them, sometimes copied their designs onto new seals. They recognized these objects as links to the past, as connections to the people who had lived in Mesopotamia before Sumerian civilization emerged. The older seals were treated with special reverence, as if their age itself gave them power or authority. When archaeologists examined large collections of seals across time, they could see how certain motifs persisted across centuries, copied and recopied, elaborated and modified but maintaining recognizable core elements. Some designs appeared first in Ubaid contexts and continued through Sumerian and into Babylonian periods, spanning thousands of years of transmission. The consistency suggested these weren't random decorative choices, but meaningful symbols whose significance was preserved even as the cultures that created them transformed. These seals were carrying messages across time, preserving in stone and clay images whose full meaning we may never recover, but that clearly mattered deeply to the people who carved them, used them, and carefully preserved them for future generations. In the hills and valleys of the Fertile Crescent, archaeologists have identified a cultural horizon that preceded Sumerian civilization by 5,000 years. The pre-pottery Neolithic B culture, flourishing around 8500 BC, built substantial settlements. Some houses more than 1,000 people. They domesticated plants and animals, created complex ritual spaces, and produced sophisticated art. And then, around 6400 BC, these settlements were largely abandoned. The population dispersed or collapsed, and the archaeological record shows a return to simpler, smaller communities. What knowledge did they possess? What did they achieve? And could memories of their civilization have survived in the oral traditions that eventually found their way into Sumerian texts about a golden age before the flood? The pre-pottery Neolithic B settlements emerged across the Levant and Upper Mesopotamia during a period archaeologists call the Neolithic Revolution, though revolution implies a speed that the actual transition didn't possess. For millennia before this period, humans had been experimenting with plant cultivation and animal management, gradually learning which seeds produced better yields, which animals were tameable, which techniques allowed for more reliable food supplies. But around 8500 BC, something shifted. The experiments crystallized into systematic agriculture and herding. Settlements grew larger and more permanent. Social organization became more complex. Sites like Çatalhöyük in central Turkey and Ain Ghazal near modern Amman reveal the sophistication these cultures achieved. Çatalhöyük covered 32 acres at its peak, with houses packed so tightly that residents entered through roof hatches rather than doors. The walls were decorated with elaborate murals showing hunting scenes, geometric patterns, and images that might have been maps or symbolic representations of the landscape. Ain Ghazal was even larger, spreading over 37 acres, home to perhaps 3,000 people, a population size that wouldn't be matched in the region until Sumerian cities emerged millennia later. These weren't simple farming villages. The inhabitants produced sophisticated art, creating plaster statues with haunting features, modelling human faces and bodies with skill that suggested long artistic traditions. They built complex ritual structures, spaces that appeared dedicated to communal ceremonies or religious practices, decorated with symbols whose meanings we can only guess at. They established trade networks that brought obsidian from Anatolia, shells from the Mediterranean and Red Sea, and other exotic materials from hundreds of miles away. This required organization, social structures capable of coordinating trade expeditions and maintaining relationships across vast distances. Most remarkably, they had begun the process of domesticating plants and animals, transforming wild species into forms more useful to humans. Wheat and barley were cultivated in fields rather than gathered from wild stands. Goats and sheep were kept in managed herds. The knowledge required for this transformation was substantial. These people had to understand plant genetics well enough to select for beneficial traits across generations. They needed to comprehend animal behavior sufficiently to manage breeding populations. They were conducting what amounted to long-term biological engineering experiments, reshaping the species around them to create the agricultural foundation that would support all later civilizations. And then, around 6400 BC, it ended. Not catastrophically, not in a single event, but through gradual abandonment. The large settlements were depopulated. Ain Ghazal shrank to a fraction of its former size. Çatalhöyük was abandoned entirely. The archaeological record showed a return to smaller, more dispersed communities, a simplification of material culture, a reduction in trade networks and artistic production. Something had disrupted the trajectory that seemed to be leading toward urban civilization. Climate data suggested the cause. This period, known to researchers as the 8.2 kiloyear event, saw dramatic cooling and aridification across the Near East. Rainfall patterns shifted. Water sources became less reliable. The agricultural systems that had supported large populations became less viable. Communities that had grown dependent on cultivated crops found themselves unable to maintain the surplus production that allowed some people to specialize in crafts, trade, or ritual activities. The dispersal was a survival strategy, population spreading out to exploit more diverse resources when concentrated agriculture no longer provided enough food. But the knowledge didn't entirely disappear. Archaeological evidence showed that some farming and herding continued, that the technologies weren't completely lost even as the societies that had developed them fragmented. The domesticated plant and animal species persisted, tended by smaller communities who maintained the knowledge of cultivation and herd management even without the large settlements. When climate conditions improved, when reliable agriculture became possible again, communities could rebuild, could re-aggregate, could once more attempt to create the large, complex societies that had existed before the crisis. Could memories of these pre-pottery Neolithic bee settlements have survived in oral tradition? Could the Sumerian stories of antediluvian cities, of an age before the flood when civilization first existed, preserve distant recollections of these earlier attempts at complex society? The timescale was daunting. 5,000 years separated the collapse of the pre-pottery Neolithic bee culture from the emergence of Sumerian writing. That was longer than the entire span of recorded history from the Sumerians to us. Could oral traditions really preserve information across such vast time? Yet examples from other cultures suggested it was possible. Australian Aboriginal traditions contained accurate information about coastlines that had been submerged for over 10,000 years. Pacific Islander navigational knowledge preserved detailed information across hundreds of generations. Oral traditions, when maintained as sacred knowledge by specialized keepers, could preserve remarkable accuracy across time spans that seemed impossible. If the survivors of the pre-pottery Neolithic bee collapse, if the communities that maintained cultivation and herding knowledge through the dark centuries that followed, if they also maintained stories about the time when settlements were large and populations lived, together in numbers that later generations would find hard to imagine, those stories could have been passed down, transformed through countless retellings, until they reached the Sumerian scribes who finally recorded them in clay. The Sumerian flood hero, Ziusudra, appeared in multiple texts with remarkably consistent details. He was warned by Enki to build a boat and load it with the seeds of all living things. The storm lasted 7 days and nights. When it ended, Ziusudra made offerings to the gods and was granted eternal life, sent to live in Dilmun, a distant paradise. What made archaeologists pause was how specific these details were, how they matched flood survival strategies that might actually work. The duration of 7 days matched the typical length of catastrophic storm events in the region. The focus on preserving seeds and breeding pairs suggested practical knowledge of what would be needed to rebuild after devastation. These weren't the vague pronouncements of myth. They read like survival instructions preserved in story form. The Ziusudra narrative appeared in multiple Sumerian texts, and later versions under different names appeared in Akkadian and Babylonian literature. The most famous version was the flood story embedded in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the flood hero was called Utnapishtim. But the earliest versions, the Sumerian texts about Ziusudra, contained details that suggested they were closer to whatever original event or memory had inspired the story. The warning came from Enki, speaking to a wall while Ziusudra listened on the other side. This curious detail, this circumvention of the divine council's decree through clever indirection, appeared consistently across versions. Enki couldn't directly warn Ziusudra without violating the other god's decision to destroy humanity, but he could speak to a wall, and if a human happened to overhear, well, that wasn't Enki's fault. The detail suggested a narrative that cared about internal consistency, about following its own logic rather than simply having gods act arbitrarily. The instructions Enki gave were practical and specific. Build a boat. Make it watertight with bitumen, the natural tar that seeped from the ground in Mesopotamia and was commonly used for waterproofing. Make it large enough to carry not just your family but representatives of all living things. Focus particularly on seeds, on the genetic material needed to restart agriculture after the waters receded. The emphasis on seeds was telling. This wasn't a story primarily concerned with rescuing individual animals or people. It was focused on preserving the foundation of agricultural civilization, ensuring that when the crisis passed, survivors would have the means to rebuild food production. The duration of the flood, 7 days and 7 nights, matched weather patterns known from the region. Catastrophic storm systems in Mesopotamia, the kind that cause devastating floods, typically persist for about a week. The number wasn't arbitrary or symbolic. It reflected actual meteorological reality. Similarly, the description of how the flood came, not just from rain but from waters rising from underground sources, matched the hydrology of the region where artesian aquifers could be breached during extreme flooding events, adding underground water to surface inundation. When the waters receded, Ziusudra performed specific rituals, making offerings to the gods who had survived the flood. The narrative specified that he sacrificed sheep and oxen, burning the offerings so their smoke would rise to heaven. The gods who had been without offerings during the flood smelled the sweet savour and gathered around the sacrifice. They realized they needed humanity. Without humans to make offerings, to maintain temples, to perform the rituals that sustain the cosmic order, the gods themselves were diminished. This recognition led to Ziusudra being granted eternal life, sent to live in Dilmun, where he would never die. The Dilmun detail was particularly intriguing because Dilmun was a real place, a location the Sumerians knew and traded with, identifiable with Bahrain Island in the Persian Gulf. It wasn't a purely mythological paradise, but an actual destination. A prosperous trading centre known for its freshwater springs and fertile date groves. The fact that the flood hero was sent to a real place, rather than some undefined heaven, suggested the narrative was rooted in geographical reality, placing its events in the actual landscape the Sumerians inhabited. Modern archaeologists studying flood survival strategies recognize that the Ziusudra story contained genuinely useful information. If you knew catastrophic flooding was coming, these were exactly the preparations you should make. Build or secure a boat, waterproof it thoroughly, stock it with seeds and breeding pairs of animals, ride out the storm, which would likely last about a week, then make landfall and immediately begin agricultural reconstruction using the genetic material you preserved. The story functioned as a survival manual disguised as mythology, preserving practical knowledge in narrative form that would be memorable, repeatable, transmissible across generations. When scholars decoded Sumerian mathematical tablets in the early 20th century, they found something unexpected: a fully developed base 60 numerical system that could handle complex calculations, fractions, and even early forms of algebra. This system did not show evidence of gradual development. It appeared complete, sophisticated, immediately useful for advanced astronomy and engineering. Modern mathematics still uses this Sumerian base 60 system every time we divide hours into 60 minutes or circles into 360 degrees. But where did the Sumerians get it? Mathematical systems this complex typically evolve over centuries of refinement. Yet in the earliest mathematical texts we possess, the system was already mature, as if inherited from an earlier tradition that left no other traces. The base 60 system, called sexagesimal notation, was extraordinarily sophisticated. Unlike our base 10 system, which requires 10 unique symbols for digits 0 through 9, the Sumerian system needed 60 unique combinations. They achieved this through a clever mix system, using base 10 grouping within the base 60 framework. Two symbols, a vertical wedge representing 1 and a corner wedge representing 10, could be combined to represent any number from 1 to 59. The position of these groups indicated their value in the base 60 system, just as position indicates value in our decimal notation. But the sophistication went deeper. The Sumerians understood place value, the principle that a symbol's position determines its magnitude. They could represent fractions, crucial for precise measurement and calculation. They developed methods for multiplication, division, and extraction of square roots. Mathematical tablets showed calculations for areas and volumes, essential for construction and land measurement. They created tables of reciprocals, multiplication tables, and square tables that function like reference books, allowing scribes to look up values rather than calculating them from scratch each time. The base 60 system had practical advantages for certain types of calculations. 60 is highly divisible, having 12 factors including 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. This made fractions easier to work with than in base 10, where many common fractions produce repeating decimals. For astronomy, where circular measurement was essential, base 60 allowed for elegant division of circles into degrees and time into hours and minutes. The system was almost perfectly suited for the kinds of calculations that advanced civilizations needed to perform. What baffled mathematicians was that this sophisticated system appeared fully formed in the earliest mathematical texts. There were no tablets showing experimentation with different bases, no evidence of gradually developing the place value concept, no crude early attempts that were later refined. The oldest mathematical tablets already used the system with confidence and sophistication, as if the scribes who wrote them had inherited a mature tradition that had been perfected long before they were born. Some researchers suggested the system must have developed during the Ubaid period, that the 2,000 years of Ubaid occupation would have provided time for mathematical sophistication to evolve. But the Ubaid left no written records, no evidence of numerical notation or mathematical practice. When Sumerian writing appeared around 3200 BC, the mathematical system came with it, already complete. If the Ubaid had developed it, the transition to Sumerian usage showed no signs of modification or adaptation. The Sumerians seem to have adopted a fully formed system without alteration. Another possibility was that the base 60 system derived from even earlier traditions, perhaps from the pre-pottery Neolithic cultures, or from some other source that left no traces. Mathematical knowledge, unlike writing or monumental architecture, could be transmitted orally with reasonable accuracy. If earlier cultures had developed sophisticated counting and calculation methods, these could have been passed down through teaching and practice, even without written records, preserved in the training of craftspeople, traders and architects who needed mathematical skills for their work. The canal systems that made Sumerian agriculture possible presented their own mystery to archaeologists. The earliest canals, some dating back to the Ubaid period, showed sophisticated understanding of hydrology, gradient calculation, and water management. These were not simple ditches dug by trial and error. They demonstrated complex engineering knowledge, how to calculate flow rates, how to prevent silting, how to distribute water across large agricultural zones. Some canals ran for dozens of miles, requiring surveying skills and organizational capacity that suggested either a very long period of experimentation or knowledge inherited from earlier engineers who had already solved these problems elsewhere. Southern Mesopotamia required irrigation. Unlike regions where rainfall alone could sustain agriculture, the lands between the Tigris and Euphrates received insufficient precipitation during growing seasons. Farmers depended entirely on river water distributed through artificial channels. Without irrigation, the region couldn't support the dense populations that characterized Sumerian civilization. The canals weren't optional infrastructure. They were the foundation on which everything else rested. But effective irrigation was remarkably difficult to achieve. Water flowing through channels naturally deposits sediment, gradually filling the canal and reducing flow. If the gradient is too steep, water flows too quickly, eroding the channel and wasting resources. If too shallow, water moves sluggishly, increasing siltation and creating stagnant pools that breed disease. Distributary channels need careful design to ensure water reaches all fields evenly. Storage reservoirs require precise capacity calculations to capture seasonal floods without overflow damage. Gates, locks, and control structures must function reliably to regulate water distribution. The earliest canals excavated by archaeologists showed that someone already understood these principles. Ubaid period channels demonstrated appropriate gradients, generally between 1 and 3 feet per mile, optimal for maintaining flow while minimizing erosion. Junction points where canals branched showed careful design to distribute water proportionally. Evidence of regular maintenance indicated communities organized labor specifically for canal cleaning and repair, recognizing that these systems required constant attention to function properly. Some individual canals were engineering marvels. The canal system serving Uruk included channels running more than 30 miles from the Euphrates to fields that would otherwise have been too distant from the river to irrigate. Constructing such a canal required surveying the entire route, calculating the necessary gradient to maintain flow across that distance, organizing labor crews for excavation, and establishing an administrative system to manage water distribution to the numerous farms the canal served. This was civil engineering at a scale that implied either centuries of accumulated experience or knowledge transferred from people who had already solved these problems. The organizational requirements were as impressive as the technical achievements. Large-scale irrigation required coordinated effort across entire regions. Upstream users couldn't simply take all the water, leaving downstream farmers without supply. Someone had to enforce equitable distribution. Maintenance work needed scheduling so repairs didn't disrupt crucial growing seasons. Disputes over water rights required adjudication. All of this implied governmental structures, legal systems, administrative bureaucracies capable of managing complex infrastructure across generations. Archaeological evidence suggested this organizational capacity existed very early in Mesopotamian settlement history. Even Ubaid communities showed signs of coordinated water management, implying social structures capable of collective action for communal benefit. This wasn't the work of independent homesteaders, each digging their own ditches. It was systematic landscape engineering that transformed an arid plain into the fertile agricultural heartland that would support the world's first cities. Excavations at Sumerian temple sites revealed a curious pattern. When temples were rebuilt, as they frequently were across centuries, the new structures carefully preserved the dimensions and orientations of their predecessors, even when architectural styles changed dramatically. At Eridu, the alignment of the earliest Ubaid temples was maintained through 18 successive rebuildings spanning more than 2,000 years. At Uruk, the temple platforms maintained specific proportions that appeared in the earliest versions and persisted through the Sumerian period. It was as if the builders were following plans that predated their own construction, preserving designs whose original purposes they might no longer fully understand but recognized as too important to alter. This architectural conservatism appeared across Sumerian sacred sites, creating a pattern that suggested something more than aesthetic preference. When temples fell into disrepair or needed expansion, the standard practice was to fill the old structure with clean sand or rubble, creating a platform on which to build the new temple. But the new temple wasn't just built on the same spot. It replicated the orientation, often maintained the same proportions between length and width, preserved the relationship between central chamber and subsidiary rooms. At Eridu, this pattern was particularly striking. From the earlier small Ubaid temple through the final massive structure, each building faced the same direction. The central axis remained constant across millennia. The ratio between the temple's length and width stayed within a narrow range even as the absolute dimensions grew. When archaeologists calculated these proportions, they found they corresponded to specific mathematical relationships, ratios that appeared deliberately chosen rather than accidentally maintained. Some temples showed astronomical alignments that were preserved across rebuildings. The Temple of Nana at oriented towards specific lunar positions. When the temple was reconstructed, the new structure maintained this alignment even though precessional drift had slightly altered the moon's rising and setting points. The builders corrected for the change, adjusting the new temple's position to track the moon's current behavior, rather than simply replicating the old structure's orientation. This implied they understood what the alignment was for, and considered it essential to maintain. Other temples preserved dimensional relationships that suggested they were built according to standard plans, proportional systems that dictated how large each element should be relative to the others. When researchers analysed temple architecture across multiple sites, they found recurring ratios, suggesting different cities were following similar design principles. These weren't local traditions that developed independently. They appeared to represent shared knowledge, a common understanding of how sacred architecture should be proportioned. The question was where this knowledge came from. The consistency across time and space suggested it wasn't invented separately by each generation or each city. It was transmitted, taught, inherited from earlier builders who had established the patterns. But the earliest temples already showed these characteristics. The first Ubaid structure at Eridu already displayed the proportions and orientation that would be maintained for the next 2 millennia. Someone, before the Ubaid period began, had already established the principles of sacred architecture, and every subsequent generation considered those principles too important to alter, preserving them with remarkable fidelity, even as everything else about Mesopotamian culture transformed around them. Sumerian astronomical texts demonstrated knowledge that puzzled modern researchers. They identified and tracked 5 planets, calculated lunar cycles with remarkable precision, and mapped constellations that still form the basis of modern astronomy. But this knowledge appeared suddenly in the written record, with no evidence of the centuries of patient observation that such accuracy should require. Some tablets reference star positions that didn't match the sky as it appeared in 3500 BC but corresponded to much earlier epochs. It was as if the Sumerians had inherited star charts from astronomers who lived thousands of years before them, carefully copying the data even when they might no longer remember why certain observations mattered. The Sumerian astronomers tracked the movements of Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn with remarkable accuracy. These weren't casual observations made by people glancing at the night sky. They were systematic records maintained across generations, noting each planet's position against the background stars, recording when planets appeared to move backward in retrograde motion, calculating the cycles that govern their behavior. Venus received particular attention, its movements tracked through its 8-year cycle with precision that modern astronomers could verify against computer simulations of the ancient sky. The lunar observations were even more impressive. Sumerian astronomers calculated the length of the lunar month to within minutes of the correct value. They understood the Saros cycle, the 18-year period after which eclipses repeat in the same sequence, allowing them to predict when the moon would darken or the sun would be obscured. This knowledge required generations of continuous observation, carefully recording each eclipse, noting the intervals between them, recognizing the patterns that governed celestial mechanics. But what troubled modern researchers was how quickly this knowledge appeared in the written record. The earliest astronomical tablets, dating to around 2600 BC, already contained sophisticated calculations and observations. There were no tablets showing the learning process, no records of mistakes being corrected, no evidence of the trial and error that such precision should require. The astronomy appeared mature, as if the scribes who recorded it were copying from sources that already contained the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Even more puzzling were tablets that recorded star positions that didn't match the sky, as it appeared when the tablets were written. Precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis, causes the positions of stars to shift gradually over millennia. Modern astronomers can calculate exactly how the sky appeared at any point in history by working backward through these precessional changes. When they analysed certain Sumerian star catalogues, they found the recorded positions matched the sky not from 3500 BC when Sumerian writing began, but from much earlier periods, sometimes as far back as 6500 BC or even earlier. The implications were troubling. Either the Sumerians possessed observational records that predated their own writing by thousands of years, records they had inherited from earlier astronomers and faithfully copied into their own tablets, or they had somehow calculated backward to reconstruct how the sky had appeared in earlier epochs, which would require understanding precession and possessing mathematical tools that weren't supposed to exist in the Bronze Age. Neither explanation fit comfortably with conventional understanding of how knowledge developed in ancient civilizations. Some tablets contained what appeared to be historical records of celestial events, unusual conjunctions of planets, bright comets, possible supernovae or other transient phenomena. When modern astronomers checked these against their own reconstructions of ancient sky events, they found matches, suggesting the Sumerian records were accurate observations. But some of the recorded events occurred centuries before the tablets themselves were written, raising questions about how such old observations had been preserved and transmitted. Were these references to even older documents that had since been lost? Were they oral traditions that had been maintained with surprising accuracy until someone finally committed them to clay? The constellation system the Sumerians used still influences modern astronomy. The zodiac, that band of constellations through which the sun appears to move across the year, derives from Sumerian astronomical frameworks. Many individual star names, handed down through Greek and Arabic intermediaries, trace back to Sumerian origins. The Sumerians had divided the sky into meaningful patterns, given names to bright stars, and created a celestial mapping system sophisticated enough that later civilizations continued using it with only minor modifications. This wasn't primitive sky law. It was systematic astronomy that required long-term organized observation and careful record-keeping across generations. Sumerian texts spoke repeatedly of Dilmun, a distant land where the antediluvian kings went to find eternal life, where sickness and death did not exist, where water was sweet and life was peaceful. For centuries, scholars dismissed this as a purely mythological Eden-like paradise. Then archaeologists discovered the ancient civilization on Bahrain Island in the Persian Gulf, a sophisticated Bronze Age culture that the Sumerians had called Dilmun. It was real, a place the Sumerians had extensive trade contact with, a society that had indeed existed for thousands of years in relative prosperity. If Dilmun, which sounded like mythology, turned out to be a real place, what else in the Sumerian texts might point toward actual history rather than invented story? The Dilmun of Sumerian mythology was described in terms that seemed purely fantastical. In the myth Enki and Ninhursag, Dilmun was portrayed as a pristine paradise where no sickness existed, where predators didn't hunt, where old age and death were unknown. The land had no fresh water until Enki caused springs to flow, transforming it into a garden of abundance. It was the place where the flood hero Ziusudra was sent to live forever after the deluge, a reward for preserving civilization. The description seemed archetypal, the kind of perfect paradise that exists in the religious imagination, but not in geographical reality. Then, in the early 20th century, archaeologists working on Bahrain Island began uncovering evidence of an ancient civilization that had flourished there for thousands of years. The island showed continuous occupation from approximately 3500 BC through the second millennium BC, with evidence of earlier settlement possibly extending back into the Ubaid period. The archaeological remains revealed a sophisticated society engaged in extensive maritime trade, serving as an intermediary between Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley civilization. Most remarkably, Bahrain possessed what made it genuinely paradisiacal in the arid Persian Gulf region: abundant fresh water. Underground aquifers fed numerous springs across the island, providing reliable water supplies that allowed for agriculture and supported dense settlement. In a region where water was the most precious resource, Bahrain's natural springs would have seemed miraculous, a gift that made the island genuinely different from the surrounding landscape. The Sumerian description of Enki causing water to flow in Dilmun wasn't pure fantasy. It was recognizing the geological reality that made Bahrain unique. The cuneiform tablets revealed extensive trade between Sumer and Dilmun. Administrative records listed shipments of copper, precious stones, and exotic woods arriving from Dilmun. Other tablets recorded merchants travelling to Dilmun, the prices they paid for goods, the profits they expected to make. These weren't mythological journeys to imaginary paradises. They were routine commercial transactions with a real trading partner, documented with the same bureaucratic precision the Sumerians applied to local business. Archaeological excavations confirmed this trade network. Dilmun seals appeared at Sumerian sites. Mesopotamian artifacts turned up in Bahrain. The material evidence matched what the text described. Regular, systematic commerce between Sumer and Dilmun spanning centuries. The two civilizations were connected, aware of each other, engaging in the mundane exchanges of goods and cultural ideas that characterized ancient trade networks. But Dilmun in mythology retained meanings beyond its commercial reality. In the religious texts, it remained the paradise before history, the place where those who had transcended normal human life went to live forever. The same location could be both a real trading partner, where merchants purchased copper, and a mythological paradise where flood heroes gained eternal life. This dual nature suggested that the Sumerians understood the difference between geographical reality and religious symbolism, that they could use real places as settings for mythological narratives without confusing the two categories. Yet the discovery that Dilmun was real raised troubling questions about other aspects of Sumerian mythology. If the paradise they described turned out to be an actual location, if the place where the antediluvian king supposedly lived forever was a real island in the Persian Gulf, what did that mean for other seemingly mythological elements in their texts? The King List's antediluvian section placed events in real cities, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Shuruppak, that archaeology had confirmed existed. The Apkallu emerged from the waters, and Dilmun was accessed by sea, suggesting connections to maritime peoples or cultures. The flood was described with geographical and meteorological specificity that matched real Mesopotamian conditions. As linguists studied Sumerian more deeply, they found something troubling embedded in its vocabulary. Many fundamental words, particularly those related to agriculture, religious practice, and technical crafts, didn't follow normal Sumerian linguistic patterns. They appeared to be loan words from an unknown earlier language, what scholars began calling the substrate language of Mesopotamia. This suggested that when the Sumerians arrived in southern Iraq, they encountered people already there, people with their own words for farming, for building, for worship. The Sumerians absorbed these terms, preserved them in their writing, but the people who spoke that older language left no texts of their own. They existed only as linguistic shadows in Sumerian vocabulary. The recognition of substrate vocabulary required patient linguistic analysis. Sumerian, as scholars decoded it, showed regular phonological patterns. Certain sound combinations were common, others were rare or absent. The language had rules about how words were constructed, how roots combined with affixes to create meaning. Most Sumerian vocabulary followed these patterns predictably, but certain words didn't fit. They contained unusual sound combinations, violated normal phonological rules, seemed foreign to the language even though they described fundamental concepts. Terms for fundamental agricultural activities showed these characteristics. The word for farmer didn't follow normal Sumerian word formation patterns. Neither did plough or irrigation channel or several names of cultivated plants. These were core vocabulary items, words that should be ancient and native to any agricultural society, yet they appeared to be borrowings from an earlier language. Similarly, craft terms like smith, potter, and carpenter showed substrate characteristics. Religious terms including priest and names of certain deities seemed to be loans rather than native Sumerian words. Even more tellingly, many place names in southern Mesopotamia didn't follow Sumerian linguistic patterns. City names, river names, geographical features often contained elements that were un-Sumerian in structure. These names predated Sumerian occupation, given to places by earlier inhabitants whose language differed from Sumerian. When Sumerian speakers arrived, they adopted the existing place names rather than renaming everything, preserving in their language evidence of the people who had lived there first. Linguists could identify these substrate words but couldn't reconstruct the language they came from. With only isolated vocabulary items preserved in Sumerian, lacking any texts written in the substrate language itself, there wasn't enough data to determine what kind of language it was, what family it might belong to, or how it functioned grammatically. The substrate language existed as a negative space, visible only through the holes it left in Sumerian vocabulary, the words that clearly didn't originate in Sumerian but whose true origins remained unknown. The most likely candidates for substrate speakers were the Ubaid people, who had occupied southern Mesopotamia for 2,000 years before Sumerian civilization emerged. They had built the first temples, established the first large settlements, developed the agricultural systems that later Sumerians would inherit. They must have had language, must have had words for all these activities. When Sumerian speakers arrived, whether through migration or cultural transformation, they would have encountered this established agricultural society with its existing terminology. Adopting these terms would have been natural, particularly since they described technologies and practices the newcomers were learning from the existing population. But this linguistic evidence confirmed a crucial fact. The Sumerians were not the first people to create civilization in Mesopotamia. They inherited a landscape that had already been settled, cities whose foundations were already ancient, agricultural systems already functioning, religious sites already sacred. The people who had done this initial work spoke a different language, possessed their own culture, and left no written records. They existed now only as linguistic ghosts, their words preserved in Sumerian vocabulary, evidence of a lost people whose achievements the Sumerians had built upon. The Sumerian King List ends with an intriguing asymmetry. After meticulously recording the antediluvian kings with their impossibly long reigns, after noting the flood, the tablets then list the post-flood dynasties with much more reasonable reign lengths: 40 years, 36 years, 21 years. These numbers were within human possibility, historically verifiable in some cases. Why would the same scribes who carefully recorded quarter-million-year chronologies suddenly shift to realistic timescales? Either the earlier numbers were purely symbolic, meant to convey mythological time, or they were recorded in a measurement system the later scribes no longer understood, faithfully copying numbers whose original meaning had been lost in the centuries since the flood they described. The transition in the King List was abrupt and striking. Before the flood, reigns of 28,000 years, 36,000 years, 43,000 years. After the flood, reigns of 28 years, 40 years, 36 years. The contrast couldn't be more dramatic. It was as if the scribes had simply moved decimal points, transforming impossible numbers into reasonable ones. But the text showed no awareness of this shift, no acknowledgement that something fundamental had changed in how time was being measured or recorded. Post-flood rulers could often be verified through other sources. Their reigns could be cross-referenced with building inscriptions, with synchronisms to rulers in other cities, with archaeological evidence from the periods when they supposedly ruled. The King List's post-flood section functioned as legitimate history, a chronological framework that historians could use with reasonable confidence. These were real people who had actually ruled real cities for humanly possible lengths of time. This meant the scribes who compiled the King List understood historical documentation. They knew how to record actual chronologies, how to maintain accurate lists of rulers and their reign lengths. They weren't incompetent or credulous. They were capable historians working with the evidence available to them, which made their handling of the antediluvian section even more puzzling. If they knew how to record history properly, why did the pre-flood section contain impossible numbers? One possibility was that the antediluvian section was intended to be read differently, that the enormous numbers were markers indicating, this is mythological time, not historical time. The shift to reasonable numbers after the flood would signal to readers that they had moved from the age of myths to the age of history, from a time when divine and human timescales mingled to a time when normal human chronology applied. This interpretation treated the King List as a sophisticated literary document that used numerical symbolism to distinguish between mythological past and historical present. But another possibility lingered, one that scholars found more troubling. What if the antediluvian numbers were copied from earlier sources that used a different counting system, and the Sumerian scribes had faithfully preserved these numbers without understanding how to convert them to their own chronological framework? They would have recognized these were important records, that maintaining the numbers accurately mattered, even if they no longer knew exactly what the numbers measured. They might have suspected the numbers weren't literal years, might have understood they represented some other temporal framework, but lacking the key to convert them, they simply copied what they found in their sources, trusting that future generations might understand what they themselves no longer knew. This interpretation suggested the antediluvian section represented genuine historical memory, records that had been preserved across centuries or millennia through careful copying but whose original context had been partially lost. the Sumerians found themselves in possession of documents describing an earlier period of civilization, records that claimed certain cities had existed before the flood, that certain rulers or dynasties had governed during that period, that specific events had occurred. They preserved these records as faithfully as they could, even the parts they might not have fully understood, because they recognized them as important accounts of what had come before their own civilization. In museum archives and university collections around the world, thousands of Sumerian tablets still await full translation and analysis. New texts emerge regularly from ongoing excavations in Iraq, adding pieces to a puzzle that grows more complex rather than clearer with each discovery. The question these tablets pose has not been answered. Were the Sumerians describing their own history, metaphorically inflated and mythologized beyond recognition? Or were they, as their own text repeatedly claimed, carefully preserving the records of something that came before them, something they considered themselves the inheritors of rather than the originators of? The clay tablets cannot tell us what their authors believed. They can only tell us what they chose to write down, to preserve, to send forward through time for us to find. Every year, new tablets emerge from excavation, or are identified in museum collections where they have been misfiled or overlooked. Each one adds information, sometimes confirming what we thought we knew, sometimes contradicting it, often raising new questions that previous discoveries hadn't prompted. The Sumerian archive is not closed. We don't yet have all the evidence. Future discoveries might clarify mysteries that currently seem insoluble, or they might deepen the puzzle, revealing complexities we hadn't imagined. The tablets themselves are fragile. Made of clay, they survive better than papyrus or parchment, but they're still vulnerable to breakage, to erosion, to the slow dissolution that comes from being buried in damp soil for millennia. Many tablets that reach museums are fragmentary, missing crucial portions that would clarify their meaning. Scholars work like puzzle solvers, trying to fit pieces together, comparing similar texts from different sites, attempting to reconstruct complete narratives from scattered fragments. Translation remains uncertain for many passages. Sumerian grammar is complex, its vocabulary vast, and we're still learning nuances of how the language functioned. Words that appear infrequently might be understood only approximately. Technical terms whose meanings were clear to ancient readers puzzle modern translators who lack the cultural context to interpret them correctly. Each new text sometimes forces revisions in how we understand previously translated material, as new contexts reveal that words we thought we understood actually carried different meanings. The scribes themselves were not uniform in their purposes. Some were bureaucrats recording taxes and temple inventories, unconcerned with larger historical or theological questions. Others were priests preserving sacred traditions, copying myths and rituals that maintained religious knowledge across generations. Still others were scholars, men who collected, compared, and synthesized information from multiple sources, creating reference works like the King List that attempted to organize knowledge systematically. Each type of scribe had different standards for accuracy, different attitudes toward the material they were recording, different purposes for creating their tablets. We can know what the tablets say. We can translate the cuneiform, reconstruct the narratives, catalogue the information they contain, but we cannot know with certainty what the scribes believed about what they were recording. When they copied the antediluvian section of the King List, with its impossible reign lengths, did they believe these were literal facts? Did they understand them as symbolic? Did they recognize they were preserving information whose original meaning they no longer fully grasped? The tablets don't tell us, they simply present the information, leaving us to interpret not just the content but the scribe's relationship to that content. What remains undeniable is that the Sumerians themselves insisted, repeatedly and consistently across multiple texts, that their civilization was not the first. They claimed kingship had descended from heaven to Eridu. They described 7 sages who taught humanity. They recorded cities existing before the flood. They preserved names of rulers from antediluvian times. They treated Dilmun as both a real place and a mythological paradise. They borrowed vocabulary from an earlier substrate language. They maintained astronomical records older than their own writing. They followed architectural plans and mathematical systems that appeared fully formed rather than gradually developed. These weren't occasional claims or isolated references. They formed the foundation of Sumerian self-understanding, the framework within which they made sense of their own existence. The Sumerians saw themselves as preservers and transmitters of knowledge that had been given to them, as the current guardians of a tradition that stretched back beyond memory into a past they could glimpse only imperfectly through the texts and practices they had inherited. Whether that self-understanding reflected historical reality, or was itself a powerful myth they had created to make sense of their origins, remains the question that the tablets, despite all they tell us, cannot definitively answer. And so the question remains suspended in the silence of museum archives, in the dust of tells not yet excavated, in the thousands of tablets that still wait to reveal what their ancient authors knew and what they believed about the world before their own. The Sumerians left us a gift across 5,000 years, not just the first writing, not just the first cities, but the first recorded uncertainty about whether humanity's story truly begins where we think it does, or whether it reaches back further into ages we can glimpse only through fragments and shadows, and the stubborn insistence of ancient scribes that something came before. Perhaps what matters most is not solving the mystery, but recognizing that the mystery exists, that the people who gave us writing and mathematics, and the wheel also gave us humility, the acknowledgement that they too stood in the middle of a story whose beginning they could not clearly see. They looked backward into time the way we look backward at them, trying to understand what came before, what was lost, what was preserved, what might still be waiting to be remembered. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you're connected to those ancient scribes across the vast distance of millennia. They too lay down at night under the same stars in the same darkness, wondering about the past and what it meant for their future. They pressed their concerns into clay and sent them forward through time, hoping someone would eventually understand. And here you are, having heard their questions, having walked through their cities in imagination, having touched the same mysteries that troubled them enough to preserve for generations they would never meet. The tablets rest now in climate-controlled cases, their cuneiform mark still holding questions that may never be fully answered. But perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps some knowledge is meant to remain just out of reach, patient as clay, waiting in the dark for the moment when we're finally ready to understand what our ancestors were truly trying to tell us about the depths of human time and the persistence of memory. So let yourself drift now into the same darkness those ancient watchers knew, under the same stars they tracked with such devotion and care. You're part of the same human story, the same long conversation across generations about where we came from and what we've forgotten along the way. The questions can wait. The tablets will still be there tomorrow. For now, rest. Let the ancient world hold its mysteries while you sleep. The Sumerians waited 5,000 years for us to find their warnings and their wonders. They can wait a little longer, patient as the clay that holds them, while you drift into dreams beneath the same sky they watched, the same night they knew, the same quiet dark that connects us all across the impossible distance of time. Rest now, sleep well. The ancient world will still be here, waiting with its secrets when you wake.